hello everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your busy day. For those of you that I have not met yet, I'm Massey, and I've worked for 4 airlines over the past 14 years. 9 of those years were at JetBlue. And my role at the airlines was to develop, implement, and manage their SMS programs. And so we'll talk about safety management systems and how it can affect your flight at FTP. So we'll go into a little bit of depth on that. And then most recently, last year, I had an opportunity for a position in London for an aviation software company to lead a team of developers on their next generation SMS risk management software, specifically utilizing AI, artificial intelligence, to get to a higher level of risk predictability in aviation. So SMS is comprised of 4 components. And so today we're going to talk about one of those components of SMS, which is risk management. So we'll talk about a little bit about where risk management came from and why you have it on your ACS today. And we'll talk about safety culture, because safety culture is the true driver to the improvements of aviation safety and where we've come over the decades and into the safest mode of transportation. And a lot of it has to do with that safety culture and bringing that into our own lives. So we'll go into that. And then I'll talk to you guys. I'm actually going to show you some different methodologies and different models across the industry that basically say the same thing. It's just a different way to look at it. So I wanted to bring that to you guys just so you can kind of sit back and think about how you can bring in these different models into your own risk management, into your own flights. And then we'll go into risk management principles and processes, and I'll actually show you some real safety risk assessments that are live today at the airlines. And then I'll show you guys how we can put in these risk controls, how we can mitigate risk, how you can plan for it, how you can address it during all of your flights and your evaluations and check rides. And then we can work on integrating it and customizing some SRAs for you. So that's our agenda tonight. So just to start, the evolution of safety management systems, well, where did it come from? And across the board, in any industry really, especially going back a decade, a couple decades ago, and even in some companies still today, you have something called the bad apple theory. And the bad apple theory really just maintains that safety issues are the result of a few bad apples in an otherwise safe system. So anytime there was an event that occurred, an accident, an incident, almost always, if you have a culture of bad apple theory, you will label it human error, and you'll issue reprimand or retraining. So some old view of the human error is to remove those bad apples. It says that people are unreliable, to demote them and to instill fear. But through lessons learned, there's been a shift. There's been a cultural shift for a new view of human error, and that's to identify and mitigate these systematic risks. So they're saying, if you could do it, I could make the same mistake, that it's not a bad apple, that I'm not bad and you're good. It's simply saying that there are errors that stem deeper within the system, and it could happen to anyone. And especially in aviation, they're saying the old view was that complex systems are basically safe. Well, through growth, we've really said, no, complex systems are not basically safe, that they need controls. And so we'll talk about how you guys can add in your own individual controls here in a moment. And the old view would be, restrict human contribution by tighter supervision. And now we're realizing that actually people create safety through all levels of organizations and industries. And that's really important for us, especially that one sentence, because it doesn't matter whether you're senior leadership at FTP or you are, pre-solo, you can still create safety at the executive airport, right, and at FTP. So we'll get into that a little bit too, but basically the old theory was with a fear of punishment, people will hide mistakes. And that's very true, right? For any of us, we don't want that fear of, we all have that fear of reprisal. So we want to eliminate that as much as we can. So the aviation industry realized that they needed to do this. So there's a cultural shift. And beginning in about 2001, ICAO annexes started coming out providing guidances and requirements for the management of risk in air operations, and to start changing that culture.
So there's no video.
Oh, can you see? Okay. So 2015, 2016, airlines started submitting their SMS implementation plans to the FAA for validation and approval. So some of you guys may have heard that SMS is a buzzword, but that's not really the case. It's really been around for quite some time, and actually in a lot of organizations, it's in its continuous improvement phase, though it may kind of be new to some of us today. So just kind of sit back, and you don't need to take notes in the beginning portion of this presentation. I'll tell you towards the end, you'll definitely want to take notes, and there'll be some terminology that you will want to know. But just for the beginning part, you know, don't worry about that, because you won't be tested on it. So all of these changes were designed to incorporate 3 forms of rationale: reactive, proactive, and predictive thinking. And in order to do that, and in order to manage all of the risk going on, because the people that are making, you know, our regulations, the people that are making our checklists and our flows, they're not with us on every single flight. And so they need to be able to get that information. And in order to do that, they had to change the culture, because otherwise people would hide all of these mistakes. So some of you might know or have heard of the term just culture. And just culture or safety culture, it's the same thing. The industry is kind of moving towards using the terminology safety culture, but they're the same thing. And it's really to foster an environment where free and open communication is practiced. So there's active participation in the decision-making process and questioning of actions and decisions. And we want to mitigate that fear of reprisal. So how do they do that? And if we think about driving a car, if I'm speeding, would I then drive past the police station, go in and tell an officer that, hey, I was speeding a car and I need to get a ticket? Absolutely not, right? I would never do that. But the aviation industry has said, wait, we need you to do that. We need that information because we're not there on every flight, and we need you to let us know if something has happened. As long as it was unintentional, we need that data so we can trend it, and that we can put in risk controls to prevent it from happening systematically. So, and the reason and the driver for that is because through many events, they've realized there were so many multiple opportunities for actions that could have broken that chain of event, that snowball effect, that where you just had one less negative contribution, you could have prevented an accident. And so that's what they're looking for, is that information and what's bubbling under the surface. And they can't get that without the information coming from the pilots. So let's say, to bring it into a little bit more of real life, let's say there is a bird wing sticking out of one of the sides of the engine, and you're going to fly in the middle of the day, and let's say you're going to fly 422 Charlie Bravo, so you got a nice long walk. Well, you have 3 options if you notice that bird wing. You could say, right, not my plane, not my problem, and continue walking and going and doing your own pre-flight. You could say, well, someone else will see it and they'll deal with it. It's not my airplane, or it's above my pay grade. Or you could take the see something, say something, and let somebody know, a flight instructor, or go into the office and say, hey, there's a bird wing in X airplane, you guys might want to take a look. And how that becomes important is because, let's say that airplane had come in from a night flight. The person, they didn't do their post walk around, they just tied it and rushed off, and the plane doesn't fly all day, and then it flies at night again. Well, so the next person that flies that airplane, if no one said anything about it, right, they might do some damage to the engine trying to start it up. They might have an engine failure. Something could occur. So we kind of want to get to that point of driving that safety culture of, if we notice something, that we are in fact saying something. And ultimately, you know, outside of the safety culture, if there's more damage to the engine, that means the airplane's offline for longer, rates can go up. You know, there's more things that can occur if we simply just ignore things and say, well, it's not my flight, not my problem. We're not, you know, you don't want to be in other people's flight deck. We don't want to be tattletales, but certainly if you see something that is a safety of flight issue, you know, it's ideal to mention it to one of the senior leaders at FTP. So part of SMS is moving from reactive and into more of a proactive and even a predictive form of rationale. So reactive is where we respond to an event that's already happened, right? So if I forget a checklist item, or there was cord showing, I ignored it and got a flat tire, or if you get the low fuel light, right? That's all being reactive because now you have to react to the situation. So we want to go and start thinking about being more proactive. So if we're, you know, going to go on a long cross country, maybe we go ahead and pre-plan that we get a good night's sleep. We've all, during our aeromedical training, we learned that if you're thirsty, you're already dehydrated, right? So drinking before you get dehydrated is being proactive. If you're going on a long cross country, maybe you add an additional quart of oil, even if it's still above minimums. Maybe you know that you're going on a long overnight, you got the plane for a while, maybe just go ahead and do that. And that's that proactive side. Predictive is a little bit harder. People's eyes get a little bit wide because they think you have to have a crystal ball to you know, be predictive, and that's not really the case. It can be a lot simpler than that. You don't have to have AI with software to get to a predictive level in your flying. It can simply be, you know, currency requirements, right? So as renters at FTP, we have to fly within 60 days where we need to go up with an instructor. Well, that is FTP being predictive. I know if I go past 60 days, I have bad landings, and that's Ed being predictive and saying, I know if Crystal doesn't fly in, you know, 70 days, she's going to have a bad landing, which could result in aircraft damage, right? And so he's being predictive and going ahead and putting in a control to prevent anything bad from happening. So we want to move away from that reactive, and we want to start moving into that proactive and predictive thought process. So I'll show you guys a model that's used at the airlines called the threat and error management. This is to prevent, trap, and mitigate. And it's just a different methodology to manage threats, because we want to bring an understanding to making those go and no-go decisions and making those adjustments in our flight plan. Because if we have enough, you know, if we can prevent and trap and mitigate, then we might be able to take a no-go situation and turn it into a go situation where we can actually go and fly. And some of the mentality behind this is growing ourselves from just being stick and rudder pilots and bringing us into becoming flight managers. And that'll be important regardless of what type of flying you guys do. You know, some of you guys might be on the airline path. You'll certainly see this again. But even if you go and buy your own airplane or fly, you know, an aircraft with a turbocharger, right? You can't just chop and drop it. You have to, you know, or go power idle and descent as fast as you can, because you'll shock cool the engine, right? You have to have a descent profile for some of these bigger aircrafts or more complicated aircrafts. And so that's moving away from just that stick and rudder skills and into becoming a flight manager. And with that, you want to be constantly assessing the factors of your flight too. So what you're looking at here is more casually known as the Swiss cheese model. And this model is a concept showing you how to prevent, trap, and mitigate errors. It identifies, you know, the necessary defenses that are essential for that successful aircraft operation. So if we look at the slide here, you see threats are coming in, and threats come from all over, right? There can be many different reasons for threats coming in. Oh, sorry. And so we want to prevent those. If we can't prevent it, then we want to be able to trap it If we can't trap it, then we want to at least mitigate it. And so you can see here how it's the Swiss cheese, because the more layers of Swiss cheese you have, the higher the likelihood is that you're able to prevent, trap, or mitigate it. So if we look at our defenses, this is just layers of Swiss cheese. So if we looked at preventing, right, let me go back real quick for you guys. So preventing would be, right, it's our training, it's regulations, it's company and personal minimums. Trapping, that's our checklist, that's our experience and our CRM. So an example of experience for you is, Ed has a lot more flight time than I do, right? So he's going to have more layers of Swiss cheese in his trap portion than I would, just because he's seen it before, or he's studied it, or he just has more flight experience. And then the mitigate is that pre-planning for what if, maybe you struggle in navigation. Well, in order to trap that or to mitigate your struggle in navigation on a long cross country is having a good sound understanding of the use of your automation, right? So the more layers we can add in, the safer flight we have, and the lower we can drive the risk. So as you can see, you've got hardware, you've got SOPs, you have another pilot, flows and checklist, you have external people, that's ATC, you have communications and briefings, you have that what if planning. So for some examples for you, would be, I was flying to Daytona about a year ago, and I knew that it was going to be a busy airport. So I went ahead and I briefed myself. I looked at the airport diagram. I felt comfortable. Getting in was no problem. And then I landed and got transferred over to ground. And I'm pretty sure he spoke Swahili. I have absolutely no idea what he said. Still don't. He rattled something off. Very confusing. I think there's construction and things going on. So I got really lucky, though, because I had another pilot with me. And he was very familiar with flying in and out of Daytona. And he was like, oh, yeah, you just do this, this, and this. I was like, okay, great. And so he was my layer of Swiss cheese, an additional layer for me during that flight. I don't know if some of you guys are either, airline pilot kids or have spouses or friends that you fly with that are from the airlines. But they are absolutely, an excellent layer of Swiss cheese here. In certain aspects of the flight, right? So they're going to be really helpful on the radios. They're going to be really helpful if you're flying into an airport you're not familiar with on the airport diagram for looking for traffic. They'll probably even spot the airport miles before you ever spot it, right? And so they're definitely a nice thick layer of Swiss cheese here. However, if we take that same airline pilot who has not been flying, in small general aviation planes for a while, if we put them in the pattern, I wouldn't say, that they're layers Swiss cheese. I'd actually take the layer out and say they're more of a risk. They're going to see the airspeed going from 95, 85 to 75, and I can promise you their knuckles will be white. And they may give you some bad advice. They might say, hey, you're slow and you're too low, and all of a sudden you're high and you're struggling with energy management because you've listened to them only because their view of a deck angle is just very different than what our SOPs call for, right? They're sitting up at 30 feet up in the air or something, and so they have a very different deck angle, and they're also coming in completely different airspeeds. So one way you could keep your airline pilot friend in here as a layer of Swiss cheese is to brief them. They love briefings. They're so used to briefings. They brief everything. So if you were to say, hey, these are my airspeeds, this is what's expected to be, these are the SOPs, and it might look a little slow and low to you, but don't worry about it. This is what I've been training for. Then they might still be a little white-knuckled looking at those airspeeds, but they'll probably bite their tongue and not get you into a bad situation. So other pilots can be very helpful in your flight deck in helping you out. Same thing with, what if planning. by planning for all those what ifs, especially, you know, for us with all the weather that we get here in Florida, certainly having those what ifs already planned out, so we're not shooting from the hip when we're in the air, it can be really helpful. I was flying with someone who had been flying much bigger airplanes, and he was telling me, you know, turn base, and I was actually not planning on turning base for probably, I don't know, another 10 or 15 seconds or so. And of course, because he had more experience than I did, I listened to him and I turned base, and all of a sudden I'm completely off course. Now I have to ziggle and zaggle my way back, and, you know, I basically put more workload on myself because I listened to someone else. So you do have to be a little bit careful with the other pilot and the external people in your aircraft. But they can still be excellent layers of Swiss cheese. Your automation management, the better you know your automation, the better, the more you can use it. If you know how to use a VOR and nearest airport and everything on that GPS, you'll never get lost, right? So these layers of Swiss cheese, something to think about. The more you have in it, the less likely that these threats can get through the Swiss cheese and lead you into an undesired consequence. So you have some toolkit defenses, right? Communications and briefings, the what if planning, time management. If you come in late from work, you can pretty much just pull that Swiss cheese right out of the model because you've lost your time management if you're rushing through things. So the more you divide up these things, the better, right? So just culture creates that atmosphere that encourages the use of all these defenses and to aid in your decision-making process. One thing to note, as you see, we can prevent it, right? We can trap it and we can mitigate it. But one thing that we can add to the threat and error model is luck. But if you'll notice from this slide, the luck piece of Swiss cheese has a lot more and bigger holes in it because we can't rely on that, right? I had been doing my walk around, and of course I'd done it 1,000 times, right? So I wasn't using my checklist. I was just doing my flow and my walk around, and I forgot. I stumped the fuel on the left wing and the right wing, and I forgot to get the fuel sumps from on the belly. Well, I caught myself when I went to go and put up the dipstick and the fuel cup. I was like, oh, wait, I forgot to do that. Great. So then I went and did that. So I trapped my error. However, had I been using my checklist from the beginning, I would have prevented it entirely. Now, let's say that I never trapped it. Let's say I forgot and never remembered to go and check my fuel. Well, luckily, nothing was wrong with the fuel, so I would have gotten lucky. And then had something did happen, maybe I could have mitigated it. But there's always that chance that the fuel was bad and that I would have had an issue that I would have had to deal with and been reactive. So we get into the safety risk management, the principles and processes. And you guys are aware, when you, on your ACS, you have to show your work and explain to the examiner on how you performed that process. How did you get to the decision making that you did? And he's going to expect you to demonstrate risk management proficiency throughout the practical test. So from this point on, you guys can take notes if you want to. One of the first terminologies that's important to know is hazard. And a hazard is identified as an existing or potential condition that could foreseeably cause or contribute to injury, illness, death, damage to or loss of a system, equipment, or property, unsafe operations in aircraft, or damage to the environment. And hazard is a condition that might cause an accident or incident. So that's a lot of big, scary words. So if we were to think of this example, if you can remember this example, you will forever understand risk management. If you can just think of a grocery store and spilt milk. If there's spilt milk on the floor, that is a hazard. Nothing's happened yet. It's just spilt milk. So there's then risk, right? And so you have hazards and you have risk. The hazard is the milk. The risk is the likelihood and the severity that something will happen. There will be an undesired consequence. So there's common tendency to confuse hazards with consequences and outcomes. With the milk example, the hazard is the milk, the spilled milk. The consequence is someone slipping and falling and getting hurt. An example that ICAO provides for us is a runway excursion, overrun is a projected consequence in relation to the hazard of a contaminated runway. Okay, so the hazard is the contaminated runway. Doesn't mean anything's happened yet. It's just a contaminated runway. Happens every winter, right? We don't always have a runway overrun. So that is the consequence. That's a negative consequence. The hazard is the contaminated runway. The consequence is the runway excursion. So if we look at hazards, we can have a lot of hazards in one flight. And they can lead to an undesirable operational state, which can lead to, a near miss, or it could lead to a consequence. This is one of my favorite models, because if you look on the right-hand side where it shows the red consequences, this really does bucket it nicely, where you have harm to people, damage to property, and regulatory action. And pretty much everything in aviation that could go wrong will fit into one of those buckets. So, a hazard, for example, would be air traffic. There's a lot of traffic in the air just in Florida, right? Doesn't mean anything's happened yet. Simply means it's just a hazard that exists. The consequence, of course, could be harm to people with a mid-air accident, damage to property, a whole loss type of situation. But that's where we want to get to, is we want to look for hazards, and then we want to say, hey, what's the worst credible outcome that could occur, and which bucket does it fit into? Is it harm to people, damage to property, or regulatory action? For one of the airlines using Daytona, their number one TCAS RA events from their FOCO data was in Daytona. So yeah, absolutely, it's a hazard. Has anything happened? Well, they were in this intermediate outcome, right? Near miss, they had TCAS RA events. So important to just kind of understand multiple hazards can lead you into undesirable consequences unless we do something about it. And we'll get into that. So then we have a risk, right? So again, the hazard is the milk. The risk is the likelihood and the severity that someone gets hurt, or that something happens, an event occurs. So we can utilize risk matrix, and I'll show you guys that. But if you're thinking about just that grocery store, what is the likelihood and severity of someone getting hurt? That's going to change. If we had, I think the grocery stores are still doing like a senior citizen hour, maybe 8 to 9 a.m. right now. Your severity for during your senior citizen grocery store hours, if there's spilled milk, is going to be worse, right? They may not be able to see the spilled milk as clearly. If they fall, the severity of their fall might be a lot worse than, if I fell on spilled milk, I'd probably just have a bruise. They might actually have a more severe injury. And so your severity is going to change based on your conditions. And your likelihood will change based on your conditions as well. So when we're looking at how to get to our level of risk, we want to combine the effect of our severity and likelihoods to determine that level of risk. And we'll show you some different risk matrices here in a second, but it's really just an analytical process. And then we want to look at, from the risk assessment, we want to look at the acceptability of the operation in the presence of that identified hazard. Is that acceptable? And everyone's acceptable risk levels are going to differ. What someone else can accept, will be completely different than my own. Ed, for example, will have a lot more Swiss cheese because of his experience versus my own, right? So because he has more Swiss cheese put into his model to reduce his levels of risk from experience, from flight ratings, from all sorts of different things, his risk level is going to be lower, even though he might be accepting a higher level of risk. And then, of course, we want to be aware of those latent risks, what's bubbling under the surface, those underlying contributing factors, just some things to think about, really. So with safety risk assessment, it is the decision-making process regarding the acceptability of a flight in the presence of identified hazards. Once it's analyzed, we have to determine whether we accept it or not. And we have to determine that, is it a go or is it a no-go situation? But also, if it's a no-go situation or if we have a higher risk level, what can we do in order to drive down that number into a number that's more acceptable for ourselves to go fly? So when we're looking at determining, what those risk levels are, we need to determine severity. We need to determine or estimate likelihood. And severity is the impact of a hazard or outcome in terms of the degree of loss or harm. So it's completely independent of likelihood. An example for you on severity is if I fell, I would maybe have a bruise on the spilt milk, where as an elderly person maybe break a bone. So there's different levels of severity, but we do always want to go with the worst credible scenario. And then likelihood, that's the rate of how often that event is expected to occur. However, you should note that historical data doesn't always represent those future conditions. So it's just something to think about. So jumping straight into what risk matrix look like, and this is one that came from an airline. And so you'll see on the left-hand side where you have likelihood, and it's really saying, the likelihood of happening once a day, once a month, to every, once in 3 months, or even once in 10 years, that once in 20 years. And then at the bottom, you'll see severity. So we start with just physical stress and discomfort, and then we make our way through injuries, NTSB, serious injuries, OSHA reportable injuries, even fatality and multiple fatalities. And so we want to look and say, right, well, if we have a grocery store and we have spilt milk, well, where would we fall on the harm to people? Well, we want to take that worst credible outcome and just, for fun, we'll say it's a serious injury. But how often do we think that'll occur? Well, I think it'll occur once a week to once a month. If we don't do anything with no risk controls, that we could potentially have a D3 here, which was a level 5, and that's red and bad, right? Because we don't want anyone to get hurt. So these risk assessments and risk levels, they're done on judgment, experience, and then also input from your leaders and from your instructors. But when you're looking at your flight, start thinking about, hey, what is the potential severity and likelihood to each risk? And then here we have a damage to property. So an example for you on damage to property. So you can see the difference here where we've gone from injury to people to then cost of damaging an aircraft, and even to a whole loss over here where we've completely beat up the airplane. So maybe something very small like a tire change, and then the likelihood of that occurring. There's reasons why we have certain FCP guidelines and rules that we have to follow, right? So I recently went from flying all left seat to flying in the right seat. Well, the first couple of times I flew in the right seat, I certainly had a high risk of damage to property, right? My deck angle was completely off. I'm not on course. It was a mess of a landing. Maggie can tell you. So Maggie, and my instructor, was there as my risk control to prevent anything from this happening, so that I didn't damage the aircraft. But also things to think about when you're making decisions like flying in heavy crosswinds, certain turbulent events. You certainly want to think about, hey, if something worst credible outcome, where would this fall in the matrix? Would it be, minimal to no damage, or could I be possibly looking at some severe damage to the aircraft? Because that's important. So this one, regulatory action. I sort of developed this, modified it, if you will, to be a little bit more towards GA flying. The original risk matrix was for an airline and what they consider regulatory action. So some of this is just sort of my guesswork here, but essentially, if we don't follow the rules, right? If we have intentional disregard, and intentional disregard is usually drugs, alcohol, or lying, or never following SOPs, right? So intentional, it's not bad apple theory because it's intentional, if that makes sense. But absolutely, if we never follow SOPs, yeah, we could lose our flight privileges at FTP. If it becomes something worse, then we could get a letter of investigation or have a counseling session, remedial training, suspension, standard revocation. I didn't even know what this was until I was talking to the FSDO the other day, but it's basically where they can suspend your license for a period of time. And that time is usually dependent upon what the lawyers decide. And then they will basically make you start over from scratch. So you'll have to do all of your flight training, your licenses, all the way back from the beginning. Which, if you have a couple, it's devastating regardless of whether you're a private pilot or a commercial CFI, but still very devastating to be in this standard revocation column. And then of course you could have complete non-compliance and have individual airman certificate action. So things to think about when you're making your decisions in each of one of your flights. So we have risk controls. In order to mitigate all that red that was just on the screen, we have something called risk controls. And this is where we can put these items in place to prevent and to mitigate those hazards from occurring. And that's risk controls, and those layers of Swiss cheese are the same thing, just two different ways to look at it. So we want to look at the worst credible outcome, and then we want to put in all these risk controls and get ourselves an estimate of our current risk. So if you are, have someone with a lot of flight certificates and ratings and you have a lot of flight time, certainly you'll have more layers of Swiss cheese, or you'll have more risk controls to drive down that risk, right? And if you need help, you have other people's judgment, experience, and input from instructors and leadership. And then you need to analyze it and then assess it for acceptability. So here is one way to look at risk controls, because not all risk controls are equal. So if you look at the last two columns on the right-hand side, the type and the score, you'll see where we have at the bottom engineered safety controls, which is a 5, and then as you can see, we go up and they become less and less effective. So for example, if we have a fixed gear aircraft like our Cessna 172, it's highly effective that we won't have a gear up landing, right? It's an engineered safety control. So we can take credit with it with giving a level 5 there. Our stall warning horn, that's a warning device. So it's not perfect, it doesn't keep us from stalling. It's not an engineered safety control, but it is a warning device. And so it gives us a 3, and it's moderately effective. But then we go up and we look at, emails, communication bulletins, seminars. They get a level 1. They're minimally to actually ineffective. So when you're looking at putting in your risk controls in, do take that into consideration to how truly effective your risk control is. Okay, so what I'm going to do is actually jump into showing you guys some real SRAs. Actually, before I do so, does anyone have any questions so far? No? Okay.
No, you good.
Cool. All right, so I'm going to show you guys an SRA. This is it's a live one from an airline, and the history behind this one came from December of 2018, and it was a FOT, so it's a flight operations transmission that came from an event that happened in May of 2018 from an airline in China. I might be mispronouncing this airline, Sichuan Airlines, and basically what happened was at 32,000 feet, the window blew out. The FO was not sucked out completely, but according to the captain's statement, he did have to pull the FO back into the aircraft. The FO was, he was severely injured. Actually, I don't think he was severely injured, but he was injured. And of course, they did a depressurization diversion into Chengdu. So because of that event, it drove Airbus to initiate this FOT that went out to all Airbus operators. And it specifically gave the guidance to, if there was to be a cockpit windshield or window cracked situation, that they add into their QRH procedures, their quick reference handbook, which is it's basically emergency guidance or emergency procedures for airliners, that the crew should immediately fasten their shoulder harness, and then if the crack is determined to be on the inner windshield, that the crew will don their oxygen mask. So anytime there's a change, whether it's creating more safety layers or if it's increasing risk at the airlines, they're required to do a safety risk assessment, and even you guys should do safety risk assessments, and we'll kind of make our way there. But this is what one looks like at one of the airlines, and they have, I'll show you some of their hazards. There we go. Here's some of their hazard categories. So remember, when we're talking about hazards, we're just talking about something that exists out there, like air traffic or spilt milk. Nothing's necessarily happens, right? And that's a hazard. And here's a list of what they deem hazards. And they have a lot of the same hazards that you and I have flying out of executive. They have air traffic. They have, fuel quantity and quality. They have airframe airworthiness. Crew member, they have fatigue. We certainly all combat fatigue, especially in this hot heat, right? And between work and getting a good night's sleep. We have performance and competency. So a lot of the hazards are the exact same for those guys that exist for us as well. So when they went to do this SRA, the safety risk assessment, they started with saying, right, well, this belongs under airframe airworthiness. And their hazard statement is a flight deck windshield cracks could create a depressurization situation. It's true. And so then they go and they say, well, what's that potential consequence? Well, the consequence of an event with a windshield cracking could be that the suction could become severe enough to injure a flight crew member, which is exactly what happened at that airline in China. So they've broken it down into these three categories: harm to people, damage to property, and regulatory action. So let's take a look at how they did this. And again, they're looking at the likelihood and the severity that someone gets, has suction enough from that windshield to injure a flight crew member. So look at harm to people first, and they said, okay, it's a B10. All right, so what did they say? At a B10, they said actually that situation could create a fatality, but it's highly unlikely. And because of that, they've said it could maybe happen once in 10 to once in 20 years, if it happens at all. So they've given it a level 3. Right? Away. There we go. So if we then go back to our hazard, and they've done a damage to property, and they've listed it as an E10. So we look at that matrix. An E10, they said it's it's $1,000 to maybe $10,000. And the reason they're saying that is that's they've talked to their maintenance team, and their maintenance team said, hey, to replace a windshield, it's going to be less than $10,000. So that's how they got to the severity on the damage to the property. And then on the side, you'll see where they're saying, again, we don't think that's going to happen, very likely. So the worst case scenario here is you have a D10. And then there's regulatory action. Now this one will look a little bit different than the matrix I showed you before, because this is airline specific. So you'll see that their best case scenario is a loss of individual airman certificate. Their worst case scenario is, getting through BDRPs and letters of investigation, even going past being, litigation, being sued, is actual loss of certificate or loss of AOC, which is meaning they can no longer operate as an airline. And so you can see that it looks a little bit different from their perspective. I can't remember what the number was, sorry, G10. So in this case, the airline said, worst case scenario, we'll have to file a voluntary disclosure, which is basically where the airline will go to the FAA and say, hey, we had this happen, we made a mistake, and so we're going to issue a corrective action plan. And that plan, it will prevent this from happening in the future. It's kind of like an agreement to where the airline's telling the FAA something bad happened that shouldn't have happened, and so they're going to fix it, and the FAA says, okay, just fix it and you won't get into trouble. The airlines have very similar reporting processes. Maybe you guys have heard of ASAP, Aviation Safety Action Program, where, again, the pilots this time can go and say, hey, I made a mistake. I didn't mean to, though, but I did make a mistake. Here's the information. And it's kind of like a get out of jail free card. They don't get in trouble for it. And the reason for that is to get all of that information that you don't get when you're sitting in an office and not flying every single day. And so you can take that information and then put it more realistically into these SRAs and into your leadership decision making and the things that make policy and procedural changes in an airline. And to get to more realistic, decision making. And that's what that kind of means. So basically, they're saying, right, we'll tell on ourselves, and you'll give us a get out of jail free card. And that goes back to that just culture or safety culture. So when they're doing this, this is their worst credible outcome, right? And so their worst credible outcome's a 3, which is still fairly low. And then they're going to take all these current risk controls they already have in place. So they're saying that their windshield is 3-panel design. So that's a design. So they're going to get a high score for that. They've got tech ops inspections and checks. They've got logbook entry. If the pilots see anything, any cracks in the windshield, they can write it up. They have that QRH procedure, that quick reference handbook procedure, if there is a depressurization situation that they can comply with, and they have manufacturer directives. So all in all, without making any changes whatsoever, they already have an effective system. So then what they'll do is they will come in and they'll say, well, what's our new change? What are the new or the changes to the current risk controls? And these changes are, now they're going to have to immediately put on that shoulder harness, and they're going to have to don their oxygen mask. And because of that score, where we originally started at a 3, and then it drove this number down to a 1, you can't get lower than a 1, it keeps that residual score at a 1. But to show you guys how this kind of works, let's say I made this harm to people a 5, you'll see that that's going to raise the current risk level. So depending on where you start, and dependent on the score of your risk controls, will ultimately affect your final residual risk score. So as you can see, had we had much higher levels, we would have ended up with a higher level at the ends. So let's go look at an SRA that's a little bit more tailored for us at FTP. So here we have an example, and I've made this up. This is not an official SRA for FTP. I just shot from the hip and made it up. By no means is it, signed off by leadership in any way. It's just something that I kind of played with and put together. But I identified a hazard of crew member performance and competency. And I said, right, so pilots that go extended periods without flying can have a lapse in skill set, flying ability, reaction time, and overall knowledge. And I think we can all agree to that, right? If any of us have had, a couple weeks off from flying and you get back in the plane, you feel rusty, right? Your landings may not be as good, or even if they are, something else, you just feel out of whack. You're just not, the same pilot that you would be if you were flying every single day or a couple times a week. And so that's the hazard, right? It's just simply if we go for extended periods of time, we're not at our best. That's not saying anything that, is shocking by any means. The consequence would be that, the pilot's lack in currency could result in an incident or accident. And that's really worst case scenario. I have more hazards under this though. If we go down a little bit, I don't know if you guys can see where I'm at, but the second consequence could be a pilot lacking currency could violate airspace restrictions, right? We're surrounded by a lot of airspace restrictions with our Class B right here. So absolutely, if we haven't been flying for a little while, we could make that mistake, right? We could be heads down and we could inadvertently have a runway incursion. And we could inadvertently miss a checklist item. We could, forget to remove the pitot tube, or maybe we don't, untie the aircraft and then try to go and taxi, and all of a sudden we need full power and we're still stuck in our parking spot. All sorts of things can happen. So you can have a lot of hazards, or a lot of different potential consequences based off of that same hazard. And you can have a lot of different hazards from, crew member performance and competency. So if we walk through just the worst case scenario one, where it could result in an incident or accident, if we go to harm the people. So I put a D7 here. And D7, I said, if I hadn't flown in a while, well, looks like I could have an NTSB serious injury. And that could happen, once a year and once every 2 years. Now, the bad part about all these risk matrix is that they're very subjective. And that is something through continuous improvement and through, some of the AI and the software developments coming out, that they're going to try and get rid of that subjectivity. Certainly I might call it an E7 here, but someone else might say something different. You might say, you know what, I actually think you could have a fatality and it could be once every year, right? Or you may feel that it's more in a lower category. So it is subjective. You do kind of have to just use some subject matter expert here to kind of get to what you think it is. But in this case, I said it was level 3. Damage to the property. So I put that as a little bit higher. I put that as a C7. Damage to the property. So I said you could have a, once a year to once every 2 years, you could have over $50,000 in damage to your aircraft. And then regulatory action, I actually put a 5 here, a B6. So B6, I said once, 6 months to once a year, you could have that standard revocation. And truthfully, you could actually have airman certificate action. I could have put it as maybe an A6 as well. But that's important for us to think about when we're going in and looking at our hazards to make that worst credible outcome. But we're not going to live in this 5 range, this 5 no-go, never fly, there's too much risk in aviation, right? Because there's so many risk controls that are already in place for us. One of the first ones is 6156. We have to have a flight review, and we have requirements for those flight reviews, right? We have initial training, we have flight reviews, we have additional ratings, all of our training that comes into play, and we can take credit for those to lower those risk scores. We have wings and AOPA programs. There might even be more risk controls that I didn't even think about to put on here. But all in all, because these risk controls score high, actually, the industry alone has already given us a pretty effective risk control to make sure that we don't end up in an incident or accident just based off of our currency alone. So these add up and they lower our risk scores. Now risk scores will have approval levels from a can, if you will. So if I was to show you this real quick, if you were to look at it, you could look at it from a monetary value, or you could look at it from, the level of risk. But a level 1 is the lowest one, meaning as the PIC, I can say, yes, that's a go or no go item. If as you move up to level 3, 4, and 5, now you're talking about decisions that maybe need to be made from someone higher in the organization. So then we look at what does FTP do to even further lower the risk of being not current and having something bad happen. Well, FTP puts in those currency requirements, right? They make us fly at least once every 60 days. Then we have our SOPs that we have to follow, and we have published checklists. So when we look at this, we actually end up with an effective risk score. So we drove this because of risk controls, because of those layers of Swiss cheese. We drove it from worst case scenario, red 5, death, to all the way down to a 2, which is a very acceptable minimal risk score. Any questions on SRAs and just kind of how this looks and the methodology behind it? Okay. All right, so I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint here. Stand by, y'all. Okay, so this might start to look a lot more familiar to you guys. And this is where if you want to take notes, certainly, please do. So we want to look at risk mitigation. So how do we mitigate those risks? And risk management is that decision-making process designed to perceive those hazards, assess the level of risk associated with each hazard, and determine the best course of action. So that doesn't mean that we can't go flying, but it might mean that we need to alter our course. Maybe we need to not go GPS direct, but we actually have to, change our course in order to get around a big thunderstorm. It might mean that we might need to add in layers of Swiss cheese. Maybe it's that you're going to go fly at a short runway. Well, there's things that you can do to prepare yourself ahead of time, right? You can go in the PHAC and the airplane flying handbook, and you can read about short field landings. You could go practice some, or you have a nice big long runway at executive, or you can go to, a POPCA and go practice some landings there. And so there's things that you can do to add in those layers so that when you're going with all your friends and you're going to that short runway, that you've already put in those layers of Swiss cheese and you're prepared and ready for that flight situation. So when we look at our 5 Ps, the very first one, of course, is us, right? You can use the I am safe, the illness, medication, stress, alcohol, fatigue, and eating, right? One of the best things you can do is just making sure that you're ready. And then, of course, the plan. Of course, you have to do your planning accordingly. But sometimes your plans might change, and you're going to have to address this throughout the flight because the conditions and the factors during the flight can change. Of course, the airplane, are you potentially looking at an IFR flight? Well, is your airplane IFR ready? Passengers, passengers can throw all sorts of different curveballs at you, and you may have to, they might get sick, you might have to divert. You could have weather changes, you could have, headwinds that end up stronger than what you thought they were going to be. You could have ATC reroutes. So as you're going through your flight, you want to start looking at that, and it's not just during your pre-flight situation, right? Yes, of course it's pre-flight and pre-takeoff, but it's also hourly or midpoint during the flight, your pre-descent, your approach, really any time during the flight where factors might slightly change. you need to take a look at your risk levels and say, right, has anything changed? Do I need to add in any risk controls? Do I need to, do I need to divert, or do I need to, are the winds where I feel comfortable? Does everything meet my personal minimums as well? So these 5 Ps are based on the idea that the pilot could make one critical decision, or you could make multiple small decisions, and when they add up, they end up being a critical decision, right? And so we want to drive towards that risk management. And I feel like if you were to say, during a check ride or prog check, hey, I've looked at my risk. We've got a slight change. We've got an increase on our risk score because the winds have changed. However, I've done X, Y, Z, and I feel comfortable in this higher risk score. Or, you know what, let's go and change our airport. Maybe Leesburg has better winds, and maybe let's change and go over there. And so that's what they're wanting to see, and that's what the ACS is sort of expecting, is that you're utilizing this thought process throughout your entire flight. So some of you guys have heard of the PAVE, right? Pilot, aircraft, environment, and external pressures. And so you start with yourself, just like you would on the 5 Ps, is how are you doing? If it's been a long flight, are you fatigued? Did you bring a bottle of water with you in this really hot weather? How's your aircraft as well? How's the aircraft performance? Are you within all of the limitations? Is the aircraft worthy? The environment in Florida, our weather changes constantly. You need to be evaluating that risk. And then, of course, the external pressures, the get there itis type of scenarios. You want to make sure that you're addressing that and not accepting anything that's past where you feel is acceptable for your risk levels. So, finally, that when you're looking at those 5 Ps and the PAVE, you want to determine your personal minimums as well. And remember that risk management begins, days before your planned flight, and that you might have to make some alternate arrangements. So you want to start thinking risk management. I think if you guys leave today with not remembering anything that I've said, if you can start thinking about the risks that exist in aviation and how you can add in those layers of mitigation, that's what's probably the most important, because you want to find that the risk management process becomes intuitive. You don't actually think about doing an SRA or remembering the 5 Ps, that you really just add it intuitively into your own flying every day, and that you become more that flight manager, right? So I know I showed you some complicated SRAs today, but I did want to show you a simple one to use. And so we'll go do that real quick, and one that's much more realistic and what you guys can use today. So if you go to, you can simply just type into your Google search FAA FRAT, or I can send you the link as well. And what that will take you to is this page, which will give you some FAQs. It also gives you a risk assessment for if you're on a Mac or Windows, which is quite nice. I'm on a Windows, so I will use the Windows one. I've actually already downloaded it here. It's just Excel, and you can modify this and tailor it to whatever you need. Or you can use it as is, up to you. So let's go and do one. And let's say that we're going to go on a flight and we have less than 50 hours in the aircraft. So we type in yes, and that gives us a risk value. Less than 15 hours in the last 90 days, no. Let's say we've been going up with our instructor, we've got our 15 hours. But it will occur after work. Did we get less than 8 hours of sleep? Yeah, let's say we were pretty good and we did get our sleep. But we did get dual instruction received in the last 90 days. Yes, we have been going up with our instructor. And notice that that's a negative value. So that's giving us a risk control value here. And it's going to lower our risk control because we've received that instruction. Let's say no, we didn't do wings, and no, we don't have an instrument rating. Let's say no, it's not night, it's still day. Winds are okay, they're calm. But maybe we're gonna fly to non-towered airports. And no, let's say it's dry, we've got good weather. But non-towered airport, there's no weather reporting. And let's see. Don't get us. Actually, let's say we didn't get our 8-hour sleep. And maybe we are flying at night. Okay, so you can see where these values are adding up. If we scroll to the bottom, it's going to give us our total risk value of 27. So that's pretty high. And if we look here at this box on rows 52 to 56, we can see VFR, let's say we have less than 100 hours in the Cessna 172, we've got a 27. So all of a sudden we have a high risk flight. But if I go up and I make some changes, let's say I did plan ahead and I did get my 8 hours of sleep. And let's say we are going to get flight plan filed and activated, and we are going to get flight following. You can see how those are giving us negative values, and so it's going to drive down our score. So by simply getting 8 hours sleep and getting flight following, all of a sudden I lose 10 points, making it a lower risk operation. And now I'm at 17. So 17, still moderate. Maybe if I do something in addition, maybe I don't fly, maybe I fly on a Saturday morning and not after work. Now all of a sudden I have a 13. And so that puts me in a low risk situation. So that's a really good thing, right? We want to be in the low risk. And if we're in moderate risk, are we comfortable with that? Maybe you are, maybe you're not, right? And as you can notice, you know, you're going to get credit for things like having an instrument rating, and having more flight time. You have more flight time, you're not going to have that as a risk. So this is a great thing for you guys to use, to play around with, even if you just do it a couple times, and then just inherently start doing it in your head. I think that's a great thing. Even more so if you do it on every flight, certainly your instructors and evaluators would be really impressed with you. But this is what an SRA can look like, and this is how you can go and get one. You can make your own. If you want to make some modifications to this one, let me know, and I can help you with that. I'm pretty good at Excel. But anyways, I just wanted to show you what you can do to do an SRA yourself, and then also how the different factors of your flights and of your lives can completely change your risk level from going from a low risk situation into a high risk situation.
Anybody that wants that, I'm sure we can figure out a way to get it to them.
Yep. And again, you can also just Google FAA FRAT. And if you do that, by the way, the very first link will take you, and it'll kind of explain more about how to use that SRA. Even, green, go fly, yellow, think about it, and to a red, no-go situation. And then right here at the top of the page is the link that will link you straight there to this page where you can, whether you have a Mac or Windows, you can go straight into that Excel. Okay.
And if you still can't figure it out, we'll still figure out a way to get it to you.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of organizations do a risk assessment before every single flight. I don't know if you guys know of Draken Aviation, but they're a really neat organization. They actually acquire fighters from all over the globe, and they dogfight our U.S. fighter jet pilots so that they get used to flying against these different types of equipment and different types of fighters, and they can learn how they maneuver their different speeds. And before every single flight, they do a risk assessment, and they'll look at, the status of the aircraft. Is there anything that's inoperative on that airplane? Do they have a very green, meaning very junior pilot on that aircraft, with an aircraft that maybe has systems that are inoperative or something quite wrong with it? And so they'll look at the weather. And so they will do this risk assessment before every single flight. and see, if it's a go or no-go situation, or maybe if they have to change equipment or change pilots in order to get the event completed. But it's something that is starting, they do it in the airlines every day, but it's starting to trickle down into the GA world. Already, a lot of the corporate outlets, the 135 operators, they're doing these SRAs before flights and when there's changes. And like I said, you have organizations like Draken that do it before every single flight. So something to think about. Certainly, I imagine if you were to go and do that FAA FRAT tool and have that before one of your evaluations, I think your instructors would be quite impressed with you. But ultimately, you want to drive towards those risk management decisions and how you flight manage each one of your flights. So, thank you guys for your time. I hope I didn't go too fast for you. Please let me know if you have any questions or would like to see something in more depth. Certainly here to go through that with you.
Anybody has any questions? No? Is there a way that they can contact you, Crystal, if anyone comes up with questions after the fact?
Absolutely.
Besides the fact that you're out there like 4 days a week doing flight instructor training?
Yeah, there you guys go. I will put.
I thought it was a great use of the FAST.
Oh, wonderful. Good. You liked it. Yeah, it's really helpful, right? You can see how certain situations can drive your risk score up or down. And if you have a high risk score, there are things that you can do to make it a lower risk flight.
Well, we appreciate you taking your time and sharing all this with us. It is really interesting.
Yeah, of course, anytime. Well, if anybody has any questions or wants to learn more about risk management or SMS, safety management systems, I'm certainly always around for conversation. And I just put my number up if anyone wants to text me any questions. Or if you want some help creating your own SRA, let me know. I've created thousands of them over the years.
Well, you are an expert. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Crystal.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.
Thanks for
Thank you.
tuning in. All of this has been recorded, so you can look it up later as well through our Dropbox.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
All right, Crystal, I'll see you tomorrow at 1.
Yep, sounds good.
All right, have a good night. Thank
Bye.
you.